it comes to sharpening your images directly inside of Photoshop, there are several options and techniques that you can use to achieve sharper looking images. One of my favorite is the Unsharp mask filter, which has been around in Photoshop for as long as I can remember. In fact, the Unsharp mask actually got its name from a traditional darkroom printing technique designed to emphasize the fine detail in a photograph. And I can say from experience that this particular technique is extremely difficult and fiddly to say the least. But fortunately, the Unsharp mask in Photoshop is far easier to use and can be found in the main navigational menu underneath Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. When you first open up Unsharp Mask, in the dialog window you'll see that there are three sliders: the amount, the radius, and the threshold. Now, the amount slider determines how much to increase or decrease the amount of sharpening that you're actually applying to your image. And that's simply increasing or decreasing the amount of contrast in relation to the pixels. So if I just quickly increase the amount here, set at a 1 pixel radius, what you'll notice is you'll actually start to see the amount of sharpening that's being applied has drastically increased and has become quite obvious. And you'll notice that there are some halos along sort of these poles and these cables here on this little fishing boat. So they've become quite evident in this image. Now, underneath the amount slider, we have the radius slider. Now, the radius slider determines the number of pixels surrounding the edge pixels or fine lines that are actually affected by the sharpening. So as you can see here, we have a little halo effect that's occurring because obviously with the extreme amount value that I've added, but that is about 1 pixel. And as you actually start to increase the radius, you'll notice that the actual halo around the cables and the poles actually start to increase in size as you actually increase the amount of radius. So you can start to see that the amount of sharpening is increasing and the halo effect is also increasing. Now, in your images, you really want to try and avoid getting any halos because they can be very distracting and they can be very damaging to your image and they just look unsightly. So there's something you really want to try and avoid when you're actually sharpening your images. So something to look out for and just pay attention to. Now, along with the radius, if I just quickly set that back to 1 pixel again, you actually have the threshold. Now, the threshold slider actually determines how different the sharpened pixels must be from the surrounding area before they can actually be considered as edge pixels and then actually be sharpened by the filter. So in the previous example, you notice when I increase the radius here, you've got sort of a very extreme halo effect. Well, when it's actually applying the sharpening or applying the contrast, the threshold will actually determine, as you actually add a certain number to the threshold levels, that's basically saying that from the original pixels that are being sharpened, in order to be considered to be sharpened, they have to be within 7 levels of the original sharpening. You'll also notice as I actually start to increase the threshold, it actually reduces the effect of the sharpening, which is quite interesting, especially if we just knock it back to say 200 as the amount in 1 pixel. You'll notice if I go back to the threshold, we've got sharpening now, and as I just start to increase it, it actually reduces the sharpening, which is actually it's very interesting from my point of view because it's, to be honest, I've never really used the threshold. Primarily, I leave it set to 0. Some people recommend using it set between 2 and 20, and often what you'll find is if you are sharpening and you have a lot of blacks in your image, if you want to try and avoid sharpening the black areas, you'll normally set a very low threshold and that'll avoid those particular areas. But in most cases, I leave the threshold set to 0 because personally I just don't find it very useful when I'm actually applying sharpening. It's important to remember that the values entered for the Unsharp mask with regards to the amount, the radius, and the threshold should actually change in relation to the resolution of the image and the intended application. So, for example, if my images, when they actually go out to get printed on a large LED photographic printer, that I actually sharpen them differently to if I was actually to display them on the web. So I have two totally different sharpening methods. So one is for the large resolution file in order to get printed, and when it gets reduced in size, then I actually apply a sharpening setting, particularly for displaying my images on the web. Now, it's important to sharpen your images, but it's also important not to over-sharpen your images, which can destroy the quality of an image. I personally like to perform my sharpening inside of Camera Raw using the Details panel, especially now since they've actually introduced those additional sliders that give me the extra bit of control that I tend to like. But if you're not working directly with inside Camera Raw, by all means use the Unsharp mask filter. But just remember, if you start to see halo effects, you've probably gone a little bit too far with your sharpening.